Hey guys, it's your host, Angela Nicole Chu. For the latest information on this podcast and other entertainment avenues, be sure to check out theangiechew.net. Again, that's theangiechew.net.
Warning: the situations discussed within True Crime Tea may be distressing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
The East End of London was a dire place in 1888. Opium dens and brothels shared cramped quarters alongside family housing. Drunken residents spilled from the pubs into streets where children played. Violence was commonplace. Cries for help of "murder" generally went unanswered. The living conditions in the East End reflected the poverty of its residents. There was precious little access to clean water, so disease like tuberculosis and diphtheria spread easily. Some women engaged in casual prostitution to supplement their families' incomes. It was a bleak, depressing, and often menacing place to live. Which makes it all the more significant that in the fall of that year, a series of murders were committed that were so brutal, so contrary to any degree of humanity, that they stood out starkly against this grim backdrop and captured the attention of the entire world. In the East End's Whitechapel district, a string of prostitutes were butchered. The crime scenes were a gory tableau. The brutalized bodies were perversions of the human form. The killer was a collector who took organs as trophies. The signature of a letter that arrived during the murders gave this monster a name: Jack the Ripper. The city was whipped into a froth of suspicion and fear. Wide dragnets snagged scores of suspects, but the police were unable to catch the killer. Vigilante committees formed, and mobs routinely chased people through the streets. And then, suddenly, the murders stopped. Despite 3 more years of investigation, the police never uncovered the true identity of Jack the Ripper. The unsolved case was officially closed in 1892, though interest in the killings has never dwindled. A thriving subculture of amateur criminologists, ripperologists as they are often called, has been cultivated by the enduring mystery of Jack the Ripper. The details of the case are so far-flung, incomplete, and exaggerated in some instances that his identity may never be discovered. But there are some gruesome facts about the killings that, a full century later, give us some insight into behavior that we now define as the work of a serial killer. One of the reasons that the Jack the Ripper mystery endures is the uncertainty that surrounds his crimes. The most commonly held belief is that he murdered 5 women from August 31st, 1888 through November 9th, 1888. These are referred to as the Ripper murders, and are counted within 11 murders that took place around the same time. The Ripper murders had a few things in common. All were prostitutes, or were known to accept propositions on occasion. Most were middle-aged, and all were either drunks or known alcoholics. The reports of their murders read like chapters in a disturbing novel. The first victim was Polly Nichols. She was approximately 44 years old at the top of her demise. She was extremely poor, even by Whitechapel standards, and was known to be fond of liquor. She was last seen alive at around 2:38 a.m. on August 31st, 1888, and she was found at about 3:45 a.m., lying in the narrow, poorly lit street of Bucks Row in Whitechapel. She may have been alive when she was first found, but she died within minutes. She suffered an 8-inch laceration to her throat, which severed both major arteries on either side of her neck. Polly Nichols also incurred further incisions to her neck as well as violent lacerations to her abdomen. The second victim was Annie Chapman, an alcoholic 47-year-old widow who supported herself in part through prostitution after her husband's death. She was last seen alive at 5:30 a.m. outside an apartment at 29 Hanbury Street, with a man described as shabby genteel on Saturday, September 8, 1888. Within 5 minutes, another witness heard this woman's muffled cry of "No!" from the fence between his yard and 29 Hanbury Street, followed by a thump against the fence. Less than a half hour later, a resident of 29 Hanbury found Chapman's body in the backyard of the apartment block. Chapman was found with her feet pushed up against her body, knees in the air and spread apart. Her throat was cut deeply from left to right, and her swollen tongue suggested that strangulation was the cause of death. Chapman's abdomen was incised and laid open. Her intestines were removed and placed on her shoulder. A portion of her genitalia, as well as her uterus and bladder, were missing. The cleanliness of the incisions suggests that the killer had some knowledge of anatomy. The third victim was Elizabeth Stride. The night she met Jack the Ripper, Stride was 45 and had been drinking already. She occasionally engaged in prostitution, but just before she died, she was witnessed refusing a proposition. She was last definitively seen on Sunday, September 30th, 1888, by a police officer walking his beat along Burner Street in Whitechapel at 12:35 a.m. She was talking to a man with a parcel wrapped in newspaper. Around 25 minutes later, she was found in Dutefield's yard, a dark alley off Burner Street. Her legs were pulled up toward her body, knees in the air, with a kerchief tied around her neck. Stride's throat was deeply cut on the left side, with a lesser incision on the right. The warmth of her body and the lack of any mutilation suggests that Jack the Ripper may have been interrupted by the man who discovered the body. The Ripper continued killing on that same night. After supposedly being interrupted during the Stride murder, the Ripper struck again an hour later. Catherine Eddowes, a 46-year-old sufferer of a kidney disease, had been a heavy drinker for most of her life and was known to most as an intelligent, educated person. On the night of her murder, she was taken into police custody for public drunkenness and was released just before 1 a.m. Eddowes was last seen alive at 1:35 a.m. by 3 men leaving a pub. She was speaking with a mustachioed man near Meter Square, a small enclosed area in Whitechapel. 10 minutes later, a constable found Eddowes' body in the square. Like the Ripper's other victims, her throat was slit and her legs spread with her bent knees lifted off the ground. Eddowes was splayed open from her rectum to her sternum. Her entrails were spread about her, intestines laid over her shoulder and under her arm. Eddowes' nose was cut off, and deep, violent incisions marked her eyelids and cheeks. The incision to her throat was determined as the cause of death. Most of her rheum and her kidney had been removed and were missing. Altogether, the incisions and organ removal suggested to the coroner that the killer had human anatomical experience. Unlike the victims that preceded her, the fifth victim, 25-year-old Mary Jane Kelly, was young and thought to be attractive. Like the others, though, she was a prostitute and known to drink. She was the only canonical victim to be murdered indoors. With this privacy, the Ripper created his most gruesome work. The police discounted 2 later sightings and concluded that Mary Jane Kelly was last seen alive on Friday, November 9th after 2 a.m., entering her apartment house, Miller Court, and accompanied by a mustachioed man carrying a parcel. At 10:45 a.m., a rent collector entered Kelly's apartment and found her body. She was lying partially clothed in a nightgown, her feet pulled up toward her body, knees bent to either side with her legs spread in the now familiar Ripper fashion. Kelly was arguably the most mutilated of all the Ripper victims. Her face was virtually gone, having been slashed and stabbed repeatedly, with some features entirely removed. Her throat was slashed so deeply and violently that even her vertebrae showed knife marks. Both of her breasts, as well as her organs and entrails, were placed in piles beside her head and alongside her body. Slabs of flesh taken from her stomach and thighs were placed on the nightstand beside the bed. Part of her heart was missing, and there was evidence that an axe was used in the crime, along with a long, sharp knife that the Ripper had been known to use. Some people believe that Jack the Ripper murdered more than just the canonical victims from August to November 1888. Female torsos were discovered in months and years following the Ripper murders, and one possible victim was murdered in New York City. There are several other victims whose injuries fit the Ripper's technique in some ways, but aren't included in the canonical murders. The case of one butchered prostitute, Martha Tabram, has gained some acceptance as a possible sixth canonical murder. Martha Tabram was also an alcoholic prostitute and was murdered on August 7, 1888. She would have been the Ripper's first victim. Tabram was found with her legs spread and with 39 stab wounds concentrated heavily on her abdomen and groin. Behind all of this ghoulish bloodletting, there is an organized method to the murders. And over the years, a modus operandi for Jack the Ripper has been uncovered. What was this? Find out in just a moment after these words from our sponsors. Are you wanting to make between $18 and $22 an hour working from home? Are you waiting on the gimmick or the multi-level marketing scheme this is surely about? Well, never fear. With VIP Kid, you can teach Chinese kids between the ages of 4 and 12 to speak English. No knowledge of the Chinese language is required, and all that you need is a bachelor's degree and fluency with the English language. Set your own schedule, get paid based on your expertise, and connect with some of the cutest kids around. You don't even need to put on pants. To get started today, go to bit.ly/VIPKidChew for more information and start earning money from home today. Again, that's bit.ly/VIPKidChew. Looking for a good murder mystery? Look no further than author Angela Nicole Chew's fictional series, The Belle Alm Chronicles. This series features the wacky Washington family as their lives are turned upside down. You've got murder, you've got romance, you've got hippies, and you've got kidnappings. What more could you need? Be sure to check out the Belle Alm Chronicles today, available wherever books are sold. For more information, visit theangiechew.net. Again, that's theangiechew.net. Can't get enough of True Crime Tea? Be sure to join the True Crime Tea podcast group on Facebook. All you have to do is search True Crime Tea podcast group, and we'll accept you straight in and get you all the latest information. Again, that's True Crime Tea podcast group. The further one delves into the study of the Ripper murders, the easier it becomes to imagine them through Jack's own eyes. What did he feel in the hours before he murdered, or while he hunted for his victims? Perhaps he toyed with the women, buying them drinks in pubs like the Britannia, and then leaving their company, only to meet up again one last time later that evening. He would have been giddy with power in this case, believing that he held in his hands the fate of each woman that he passed. We will never know the veracity of these ideas, but there are some safe assumptions about Jack the Ripper and his personality that criminology, both contemporary and modern, has provided. As the slayings continued, Jack the Ripper's modus operandi, the methods he used in each murder, became clear. He struck only in the early hours of morning and only on weekends. These facts are revealing. For one, they suggest that the Ripper was single, since he was able to keep late hours without arousing suspicion. Secondly, they point to the idea that he was likely regularly employed during the week, which would explain his inactivity Monday through Thursday. The manner with which he displayed his victims also contained clues. All but one woman was killed by strangulation. Once laid carefully on the ground, the Ripper cut the victim's throat, beginning with the side facing away from him. This effectively drained the blood from his victims before he began the ritual evisceration. Most of the organ removal was done cleanly. In the case of Eddowes, the Ripper removed the left kidney from the front, rather than the back or side. Altogether, the eviscerations and organ removals suggest that Jack the Ripper was a person with some form of anatomical or surgical training. The knife wounds inflicted also indicate that he was right-handed. Based on historic witness accounts, modern investigators at Scotland Yard compiled a physical description of the killer in 2006. He was a man between 25 and 35 years of age, and of medium height and stocky build. Investigators also concluded that Jack was a resident of Whitechapel, and, more chillingly, that he was frighteningly normal, as opposed to the raving, drooling fiend that it may be more comforting to imagine. In 1988, 100 years after the murder, the FBI created a psychological profile of Jack the Ripper. Special Agent John Douglas concluded that Jack the Ripper was an opportunistic killer. He preyed on alcoholic prostitutes because they were easy targets. Douglas also believed that the Ripper committed other crimes which were never definitively attributed to him. Jack was a lust killer, meaning that the focus of his ritual mutilations was the female genitalia. This doesn't mean that the murders were sexual, as there's no evidence that the Ripper ever engaged with sex with his victims before or after their murders. Rather, the mutilation suggests that he was acting out violent fantasies aimed towards his mother. His mother likely provided the image that Jack had of women, one which he came to despise. She may have been an alcoholic and possibly a prostitute herself. Modern investigation has given us a clearer picture of Jack the Ripper, but this wasn't the case in 1888. It would be an understatement to say that during the autumn of 1888, residents of London's East End were jumpy. Today, we see grainy photos and drawings of dead women from a remote past. At the time, the murders of these very real people caused very real fear among the population. While we're fairly certain that November 9th, 1888 was the end of the killing spree, the people of Whitechapel at that time didn't have the luxury of hindsight. They only knew that they were in the midst of a series of brutal slayings, the end of which was uncertain, and that there was an inhuman butcher on the loose. There was an underlying suspicion of anyone who could possibly fit the description of the Ripper. Strangers passing in the street wondered if the other was the murderer. Neighbors turned one another in to police for suspicious activity. Mobs gathered easily and quickly that autumn in Whitechapel. In one instance, a man wanted by the police for an offense unrelated to the Ripper crimes was spotted by officers near the scene of Annie Chapman's murder. Seeing the police chase, hundreds of Whitechapel residents joined in. This throng, convinced that the man was the Ripper, called for his lynching. He and his police escort were mobbed en route to the station, which overflowed with angry residents for hours afterward. The fear aroused by Jack the Ripper revealed already extant underlying paranoia in the city. Xenophobia and anti-Semitism found voice in some explanations for the killings. The blame was placed on foreigners and Jews. The fear of an anti-Semitic riot was strong enough for police to keep quiet a message against Jews that was found scrawled on a wall near one of the murder scenes. Much of this hysteria was fueled by the press, with descriptions of the killer as some monster or monsters in human form, and the murders as a frightful catena of slaughter. Coverage like this extended to newspapers around the world. Letters supposedly written by Jack sent to newspapers, the police and private residence were published. One of these, the Dear Boss letter, assigned the name Jack the Ripper to the killer. It contained a cryptic reference to the killer being a member of the police force. Another letter, called the From Hell letter, was sent with a piece of a human kidney, possibly Catherine Eddowes' kidney, but was never conclusively proven to be hers. Remember, back in 1888, DNA testing was not even a concept. These letters' tones taunted the police, and not without cause. In some cases, the Metro Police and the City Police engaged in territory disputes during the joint investigation, and high-ranking officials were criticized as incompetent. The police routinely descended on Whitechapel, canvassing the area, interviewing residents, and arresting possible rippers. But they lacked the modern forensic and investigative techniques that we have today, and thus the London police never found the Ripper. Worse yet, modern investigators believed that the Victorian-era police may have interviewed him at one point and let him go. The police's inability to apprehend Jack led to the formation of local vigilante committees. The investigation eventually reached such desperation that police began removing Whitechapel's mentally ill residents and committing them to asylums under the premise that the murderer must be mad. Although the police never produced anyone who could be convicted of the Ripper murders, some investigators had their favorites for the man responsible for the slayings. As many as 170 people have been named over the years as suspects in the Jack the Ripper case. Some have proven controversial, such as the Jill the Ripper scenario of Jack as a woman. Also controversial were painter Walter Sickert, author Lewis Carroll, or heir to the throne Prince Albert Victor. Some conspiracy theories suggest that the entire royal family or the Freemasons were the ones behind the killings. Over the years, suspects have been painstakingly vetted by ripperologists, and in some cases, they've been exonerated. Take Michael Ostrog, for example. This Russian physician and convicted thief was a suspect since he was named, along with two other men, in the final report on the unsolved case, written by Police Commissioner Sir Neville Macnaghten in 1889. Ostrog hardly fit the bill, being a petty criminal and never suspected of any other murders, although he was committed several times to mental asylums. His unknown whereabouts during the murders kept him a viable candidate until author Philip Sugden wrote in his 2002 book that Paris police documents show Ostrog was in their custody in France during the Ripper murders. Macnaghten also named another physician, Montague John Druitt, who vanished after Kelly's murder at Miller Court. Druitt was later found drowned in the Thames River the following December, which fit Macnaghten's view that the killings ended due to the death or the incarceration of the murderer. The third suspect named in the report is Aaron Kaminsky. This man was insane and was committed to an asylum where he later died in 1919. Despite Macnaghten's description, he wasn't considered violent, however. It's possible that Macnaghten had Kaminsky confused with another man who was also a suspect. Enter Severin Klosalski, who was also known as George Chapman. He was named in a 1903 press interview by a lead inspector on the case. He was the only named suspect who was a known serial murderer, having poisoned 3 of his wives. He kept late hours at night, had a regular job, and was trained as a physician. He also moved to the United States and lived in New Jersey when the lone possible American Ripper victim was killed. But Klozowski used a poison to kill, a vastly different MO from the Rippers. He did, however, attack his first victim with a knife, but was interrupted before he could harm her. Another investigator involved in the original case favored Dr. Francis J. Tumblety as a suspect. He was an American doctor who'd been arrested in November 1888 for indecency and later posted bail and fled back to the United States. Scotland Yard detectives traveled to America to investigate Tumblety, but made no arrest. And another probable suspect is Joseph Barnett. He was a fishmonger and would have known his way around a knife. And Barnett almost completely fits both the physical and psychological profiles of the killer. What's more, Barnett lived with the final canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, just before her murder, and he was in love with her. It's possible that her death was the culmination of his murderous rampages, which would explain why the murder ceased. Almost religiously, modern-day ripperologists have pored over possible suspects, and their work illustrates the power that the murders still hold to this day. When the ghastly handiwork of Jack the Ripper began turning up around Whitechapel, it marked the appearance of a new brand of killer. Jack wasn't the world's first serial killer, but he was undoubtedly the product of an increasingly industrialized Western society and the anonymity and isolation it produced. He didn't kill for money, to eliminate an enemy, or to punish a spouse, which were the usual reasons for murder. The killing seemed random, and he caught the London police forces completely off guard. To catch this new breed of killer, criminology had to evolve. What is arguably the first crime scene photo was taken at Miller Court of Mary Jane Kelly, which is now standard procedure in all police investigations. The technique of comparing the bodies of victims to establish MO was also born out of the Ripper investigation. One can actually argue that all modern forensic investigation techniques find their cradle in the Ripper murders. The Ripper murders are also categorized by the media coverage that they received. This was the first time that a serial killer was given international coverage. The exposure spurred a rash of hundreds of letters. Although there's no proof that any of the Ripper letters were written by the actual murderer, they would prove to be a lasting legacy. Later serial murders, like the Zodiac Killer of the 1960s, corresponded with the very media outlets that presented his crimes to the police. The press and serial murderers came to form a symbiotic relationship. The media provides the renown that many serial killers crave, and the killers provide fodder for reporters. Jack the Ripper also had an immediate effect on London by exposing the existence of the poverty-stricken lower classes. Prior to the murders, the wealthier classes were aware of social unrest stirring in the East End. A riot and a widespread demonstration by the poorer classes had spilled outside of the East End 2 years before. But the slayings focused an international lens on this district, along with the quality of life of the people who lived in the developed world's slums. The playwright, George Bernard Shaw, pointed out that the gruesome murders succeeded where social reformers failed by managing to attract widespread attention to the area's conditions. Perhaps the most obvious legacy of Jack the Ripper is the lasting interest in the case, which has never truly waned. The Ripper has remained a consistent draw in movies, at newsstands, on television, and in tours and exhibits. The field of Ripperology is taken very seriously by those who do more than dabble in it. Many Ripperologists have written successful books, some of which have proven definitive sources on the subject of the murders. This still doesn't fully explain why Ripper's legacy endures. Certainly, the fact that a century later his identity has yet to be uncovered points to the continued interest. But a darker perspective was suggested by Alex Murray in 2004. We assume that the more civilization has developed, the more we've left behind our nightmarish compatibility of exercising brutality. Having emerged from the slums of developed society, Jack the Ripper stands as our best reminder of the potential violence latent in each one of us, no matter how civilized we become. As Murray writes, the only thing to be revealed in the investigation of Jack the Ripper is ourselves. Want to learn more about the voice behind True Crime Tea? Be sure to go to theangiechew.net for the latest in both fiction and nonfiction book releases, wellness tips, cosplay photography, and podcasts. Again, that's theangiechew.net to learn more about the voice behind the podcast.